CPS took my son in 2015 because of my drug addiction, and I'm going to share with you guys what happened, the whole story of how my son got removed from my care and how I got him back. So I gave birth to my son July 4th of 2014. That's right, he was a little firecracker, and I was high on methamphetamine when I gave birth to my son. I was blessed, y'all. The Lord God protected my son, and he came out completely perfect, and 2 days later, we went home. For the next 90 days, I white-knuckled it. And after about 90 days, I relapsed and I was back on the needle and shooting methamphetamine, along with opiates and eating benzos. But for the most part, I was really bad hard on the needle with meth. My husband was working overnights, and my mother and father-in-law, we all lived together. So I had support. I had my mother and father-in-law to help me with my son. And I started to take advantage of that and leave my son with my mother and father-in-law and not come home for like 3 or 4 days at a time because I was going on meth benders. Well, on one of my benders, my friend Tara had owed me about $30, and I had called her because I wanted the money back because I wanted to go get more drugs, obviously. And she was refusing to pay me back. So me and my husband went to her boyfriend, who was a cop, and asked him if he'd pay us back. And he said, sure, and gave us the money, and it was all said and done. Well, that pissed her the fuck off. And she called me and she said, I'm going to call CPS on you. And I was like, whatever. Well, she did. They came to my house a couple of times. Apparently, I didn't know or I wasn't there. And they finally left a note on my door. When I got that note, I called them immediately. And they asked me to come to their office with my son. So I did. And when I got there, they asked me for a urinalysis. And I submitted to one. And I failed for opiates and benzos. I had been on a meth bender, but I had taken a couple days off to get some sleep, and I was just doing opiates and benzos. They came to my house that evening to give my husband a drug screen, and he also failed for opiates and benzos, but he had a prescription for the benzos. So they told us as long as I went into treatment that they were not going to take our son. I just had to get into treatment right away. So I started looking for detox. I was ready to go. The next day, they came over and informed us that they decided that we could not keep our son and that they were going to take our son. And so I had to pack my son up and take them to their office and give my son to a complete stranger. The moment I handed my son over to them, you guys, I looked at that lady and I said, take me to detox now. Drop me off at the local detox, the closest one. And that began my journey in fighting for my son back. If you guys want to know how I fought for my son and what I had to go through, please comment down below for part 2. CPS took my son in 2015 due to my drug addiction, and this is part 2 of what happened. So, like I said, I had to take my son and give him over to Child Protective Services at their office. And then I looked at the worker and said, please take me to detox. Drop me off at the nearest detox. And so she did. I entered into a 5-day detox program, and I ended up staying for 6 days because the 5th day was going to be Sunday, and I told them, you cannot let me go on a Sunday. I need to leave here and go straight into treatment. So I need to leave on Monday and transition into the treatment center. You guys were asking a lot of questions, like, did my son go with my mother and father-in-law? Where are my parents? All these questions. I can tell you this. We tried to have my son go with my mother and father-in-law, but the state of Arkansas said my mother and father-in-law were too old. They were 60 and 65 years old. My parents were in New York, so they couldn't take my son. And my husband is estranged with his sister, and it just so happens that my sister-in-law was talking to the attorney ad litem behind our backs, trying to get custody of my son. So when they asked me where I wanted my son to go, I said I would rather him go into a foster care family than go with my sister-in-law because of the estranged relationship that her and my husband have. So Nathaniel was placed in foster care. And I'm honestly so grateful because he got placed with the most amazing family and they loved him just like he was their own. So back to me in detox. So like I said, I stayed an extra day just so I could transition into a treatment center. And while I was in detox, I worked on finding my own self a rehab to go into. And I found a place called Oasis Renewal Center in Little Rock, Arkansas. The state of Arkansas did not help me find detox. They did not help me find rehab. They didn't help me do anything. I did all of this on my own, advocating for myself. So I went straight into treatment. The first 2 weeks that I was in treatment, I was leaving every single day because I was going to court. I was going to visits with my son. It was just a whirlwind. I was never at treatment for the first 2 weeks. And during those first 2 weeks, I was relapsing on Xanax. I was lying to everybody, and I was taking Xanax. And I'll tell you, there's no excuse at all, but I was trying to escape reality. I really thought that I was never going to see my son again, and I basically just wanted to die. I'll try to answer all y'all's questions. Just put them down below, and I'll let you know and comment for part 3. CPS took my son in 2015 due to my drug addiction, and this is part 3 of my experience. So like I said, I had relapsed for the first 2 weeks while I was in treatment. I was trying to drown out the feeling of having just lost my son and having to hand him over to complete strangers. You see, I asked for CPS to place my son with my mother-in-law, but they decided that my mother and father-in-law were too old. They were 60 and 65 years old. So my baby boy had to go to foster care, and he was just turning 1. It was literally 2 days before his first birthday. So I did my time in treatment, and after 30 days, I graduated. Luckily, they did kick me out for relapsing the first 2 weeks, and they let me stay and go through the program. When I got out, my husband had gotten on Suboxone, and I remember being so angry at him because I was very closed-minded and I did not believe in Suboxone. I thought that Suboxone was just trading addictions. I was very ignorant. But after about 3 or 4 days of white-knuckling it, going to meetings, talking to my sponsor, and still struggling with temptation, even though my son was in care, I decided to get on Suboxone too. After I got on Suboxone, it was like a weight was lifted off my shoulders, and I could totally focus on my recovery and my son and getting him back. So that's what I did. I started working my ass off. I started going to meetings every single day. I got a sponsor. I was working with others. I was hitting the ground running. I went to parenting classes. I did everything. I took my hair follicle test. I was submitting to drug screens. I was busting my ass to show them that I love my son. I'm not a bad mom. I was just struggling with the disease of addiction. But in true CPS fashion, there always has to be somebody that doesn't see that and thinks that you're manipulating or whatever, and that was the attorney ad litem. She was the attorney that was representing my son, and when I tell you she did everything in her power to try and keep my son from me, that's exactly what she did. But when you're doing the right thing, it doesn't matter what comes against you. You will always prevail. And that's what I was doing. I was doing the right thing. I was staying sober. I was submitting to drug screens. I was doing my parenting classes. I was taking therapy. I was doing everything. And so at the end of the day, me and my husband won, and we ended up getting our son back. It took us 12 months, but we got our son back. We got our son back around December, and when I tell you guys, I cried my eyes out, and it was the best feeling to have my baby boy back for Christmas. If you want to hear what it was like to be a mom again, just let me know and I'll do part 4. CPS took my son in 2015 due to my drug addiction, and this is my experience with that. Now, we left off in part 3 with me getting custody of Nathaniel back. What I want to share with you guys now here in part 4 is what it was like to go a whole year without my son. Now, you have to remember that I was using drugs when I gave birth to my son. I only stayed sober for 90 days, and then I was back on drugs. So I never knew what it was like to be a mother sober. I never knew how to really take care of my son, without using drugs to give me energy and all that. So when I got custody of Nathaniel back, he had just turned 2 years old. Okay. And you know how it is when you're a 2. It's the terrible 2s, honey. And I felt like a failure. I felt like I didn't know how to be a mom. And I struggled so much the first year that my son was back. I struggled with disciplining him. I couldn't do it because I had